Creativity shows up where we least expect it. In parenting, and doing our everyday jobs, and for someone in the field of science, in designing experiments and innovating to push the boundaries of knowledge. Today we will discuss creativity with Dr. Marina Smitherman. She serves as Professor of Biology, Chair of Life Sciences, and Director of the CETL at Dalton State College. Stay for her fascinating insights about teaching, learning, and science. Welcome to this episode in Season 2 of Dialogues with Creators, a podcast that features discussions and conversations about creativity and what it means to be creative. We are a podcast that delves into the lives and thoughts of people in our region who are using their creativity in diverse ways. When we think about creativity, many times our minds go to the traditional arts, but that is limiting as far as we are concerned. In one of the seminal books about creativity, entitled Flow, by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and yes, that's a mouthful, and I'm not sure I pronounced it correctly, he spends as much time exploring creativity in the sciences and business world as in the arts. You can be creative in any number of ways, and that is what this podcast explores. Up to this point, I've interviewed writers, a filmmaker, theatrical directors, an historian, a visual artist, and a publisher. Today, we will really shift paths and talk about creativity in the biological sciences and in teaching, and mix those together a little bit, because we are speaking to an expert in both, Dr. Marina Smitherman. Dr. Smitherman is not a native Georgian, but neither am I. However, she has embraced her community since moving here in 2008. She is married to Charles, and they are the parents of Liam and Owen, who are 12 and 10. Where she moved from is a story in itself. So, Dr. Smitherman, Marina, what can you tell us about your background?
Thank you, Barbara, and thanks for asking me to speak to you today. I'm really honored, actually. As you said, I moved here in 2008. That's about 15 years that I have lived in this area, in this community. Originally, I was born in London, actually. But we moved to Oxford when I was almost 5. So I think of Oxford as home. And that's a really privileged thing to be able to say, because the town of Oxford is so international. You're going to bump into people of all walks of life there because of the university and its impact on the surrounding community. So I was very lucky to both go to school and then later university in Oxford, England. And so I got degrees from Nottingham, Manchester, and also Oxford. That's where I did my PhD. And I moved from there to Dalton, Georgia, which, as you can imagine, is more than a little bit different. So in terms of my background, my undergrad is in the biological sciences, in molecular and cellular biology. My master's is in public health, and my PhD is in clinical medicine. So when you look at the intersection of that, it's really focused on how basic sciences, what basic sciences teach us about how we can keep people healthy and living better lives for longer, thriving in the things that they do. So that's sort of the intersect of the work that I did before I moved to Dalton. And I've been at Dalton State for 15 years. I love it. It's a wonderful community to be a part of. And there, instead of doing basic lab research, although I do undergraduate research with students frequently, I focused much more on teaching and learning, teaching in the sciences.
Excellent. And I have a lot of questions I would want to ask, especially the culture shock probably of coming from Dalton State. I know you and I have talked about that. I remember you told me one time you wanted to write a book called Biscuits and Gravy, because those words mean different things. British versus American, especially Southern English. And I've just, it's a fascinating discussion we could have. So here at Dalton State, we have a tradition called the Last Lecture, which comes from the book by Randy Pausch, who was a professor of computer sciences in Pennsylvania, who found out he was dying of cancer and wanted to give his last lecture to his students and share his wisdom and insights, and it became a famous book. We recently attended a wonderful last lecture by our college president, Dr. Margaret Venable, who will be retiring from Dalton State soon. And she spoke on finding your passion and purpose. And Marina, I believe you are a person who has done that. I'm first going to ask about biology. What about biology and those related areas fulfills your purpose and passion?
God, those are great questions. They asked me several times to do the last lecture, and I said no every time because I didn't feel ready. But when I heard her speak, I thought, actually, I do feel like I have some things that might benefit. Maybe next time I could do it. But yeah, I remember the day that biology began to appeal to me. I was, let's see, 13 or 14 years old, so middle school age. And up until then, science had just been rote learning of facts. Some I was interested in, some I wasn't. A lot of plants, a lot of insects. No offense to anyone that's into those, but that's not my jam. And I remember the day that we came in and we started a topic on human health. And instead of simply lecturing to us on it, our teacher, who I was very lucky to have, I was taught biology by Dr. Krebs, who was the wife of the grandson of Hans Krebs, who discovered the Krebs cycle, which is a really important part of biochemistry. So, wife of an Oxford Don, she was pretty creative in the classroom. But this was the first time that something that she'd done had really appealed to me. And she said, well, we're going to look at blood pressure today. And you're going to, here's the equipment. You're going to design what you're interested in testing and how you're going to do it. And I can remember that moment. I'm like, wow, we have a say, we have a choice. We can test anything, in any way. And for me, that just sort of immediately awoke a curiosity and a fascination to sort of push boundaries and learn as much as I can and learn more. So, I mean, I remember the day, I can remember the classroom, I can remember where I was sitting when the sort of shock hit me of just like, oh, I have autonomy here to be as creative as I like with this. And it's not something we traditionally associate with the sciences. When you think creativity, you think painting or, even maybe writing, but creativity of thought is what leads to innovation. And so for me, that was that moment of like, oh, wow, well, this is fun. So to me, that's when science came alive as a place that I could express. I think everyone needs a creative outlet of some kind. And for me, that became my creative outlet was experimental design.
That is a fascinating story. And there's so many things I'd like to pick apart there. One is the idea that the students were given a measure of autonomy and choice and agency in what they chose to learn. I like to say in my communication classes that I want them to find their voice. And the way they're going to find their voice is if they get to talk about things that they care about rather than just me telling them they have to. So that is so, I mean, there's a podcast there just in itself about giving students autonomy, and it takes creativity to do that while still teaching them the curriculum, and finding ways to do it. So thank you for that story. And that being the case, you also are an expert in teaching. You have become the director of the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning. And that is really, I think, maybe your second or just an equal passion that you have. So talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you were right when you said that I found I found my purpose and passion in the intersection between both the sciences and teaching and learning, because as an early career teaching professor, I would really enjoy thinking about how to create an authentic, real world learning experience in a classroom setting. And so the happiest that I was ever, I think, in my office, and I'm thinking of my old office in the Sequoia building. The office doesn't exist now; they've renovated. But I would sit down and take an hour or so and think through what do I really truly want students to get out of this learning experience, and how can I bring in the real world as much as possible. And so for me, the opportunity to design, which is a highly creative exercise, to design a learning experience that is both intentional, informative, it's significant, and it's interesting, but also allows the students to exercise their own autonomy and creativity. And so I think, because probably that's my go-to, autonomy has always been important for me in learning, and that's partly because everyone has that need to learn in their own preference. We allow students to differentiate the ways that they're achieving the learning objectives. And so I can think about times where I'm particularly teaching students about healthcare, about how to explore their own need for healthy habits and behaviors, but also working with patients and helping them. And so I can think about many times that I designed learning experiences that allowed the students to, for example, practice investigating an outbreak of a disease outbreak, whilst there are step-by-step guidelines as to how to do that. I was able to, design, bring that into the lab and actually deliberately contaminate either spinach or peanut butter, and ask them to really think about following the steps through and figuring out how they're going to test for that themselves. So bringing both the creativity and autonomy for them with the very real world. This is actually how you do this. And I had another one that I designed that was allow them to be public health nurses for the day and advise patients with specific dietary restrictions about how they could eat at restaurants that they go to. So students would choose their own restaurants of interest, which patient they were interested in serving, and put together a menu, but then actually share what they learned with the class about their restaurants. And so it's real world. I think students, and we'd have a big discussion about whether it would change their choices. It was real to them because that was their life. You sort of meet them where they are. And so I could have lectured to them on, well, here are the standard amounts of each thing you need every day. But in this way, they learned that through having to explore and find those measures for people that had to work a little bit harder at it. So designing things like that is so creative. And I think people don't think about either science or teaching as that creative, honestly. But for me, it's innovative, it's new, it's fun, it's different, and requires you to think outside the box from what you could pull off a shelf in a book, honestly. And I've also done a lot of curricular design, both for faculty and for students. And so I've put together programming, undergraduate research, for example, programs for our students to really explore and share. That's sharing my passion with the students, right? That was what got me, the experimentation, the exploration of the subject was what got me excited about science. And so sharing that with students became really important to me. So I designed our undergraduate research experiences for that reason. But now, I work with mostly faculty, designing ways to explain and explore different teaching techniques with faculty in a real world setting. So as much as possible, I design a session or a curriculum that will model the techniques that I'm teaching them about. I remember when you were leading the center was the Center for Teaching and Learning at that point. You were the founding director. When you were leading it, we did absolutely have a talk by someone on how we shouldn't use PowerPoint in the classroom, and she gave that talk to us using PowerPoint. And I thought at that point, how funny. And perhaps there would have been a more creative way to do that. And so from that moment on, when I design something, I try and model for faculty, a learning experience for faculty. I try and model as much as possible the techniques that I'm wanting them to use. Which is, so when we have a session on discussion techniques, we will practice and try all of those discussion techniques whilst talking about the benefits and the importance of those. And so I think those are ways that I try and bring the creativity into the role that I have at the moment.
You know, when you were talking, I thought about something that you introduced me to, which was the high impact practices. And the high impact practices, anybody who knows anything knows the list of them. But really, what made it work for me was when I saw the quality matrices and those, what makes high impact practices high impact. And one of those, of course, is the real world experience and application of it. And I think that is where students, their light bulb goes off, that this is actually something I would use in a real situation. And it's so important, as well as the other aspects like the public performance of it, or the public display of competence, or these other things. So I bring that in for anybody who's listening as an educator, if they're not familiar with the high impact practices, that they Google that and find out what they are, because they're extremely important. And they really, I don't know if I want to say revolutionized, but they really made a big difference in my teaching, in putting a framework for what I had already been doing that was experiential, but I really didn't have the language or the vocabulary for it, as they say. So, yeah, you were talking about now your work of leading other professors to better teaching, and you mentioned how that came into your life. What do you find about that is particularly, again, intersecting with your passion and in your purpose?
Wow, that's a great question. I think that teaching appealed to me for a number of reasons. I got into teaching really, as a teenager. My sister was not doing well in biology, and I had done okay with it after those initial experiences, and so I got into teaching her. So, but teaching in the sciences, to me, I just enjoyed working with people, and I enjoyed helping them to love the subject as much as I did. And I think that's why a lot of people, really go into teaching. And so it just became something that I enjoyed more than the lab experience. Honestly, it became, even though I loved experimental design and pushing the boundaries, I really just loved working with people more. And I think that the reason I chose teaching in the sort of the human health and clinical sciences was that if you go into medical practice, you can work with X number of patients and help save X number of patients in your working career. But if you train future healthcare professionals and you train them really well, you can potentially have a much greater or even exponential impact than you could practicing yourself. Right? If you train a student beautifully, or 200-300 students a year, to really think critically and explore and understand, as opposed to just rote learn, you potentially benefit all of the patients that they work with in their career, which is a far greater number than you could have yourself. And I guess that probably sounds egotistical in some ways, and it's not really. It's just, I'm very much a person who wants to leave the world just a little bit better for being here. And so it was sort of a natural step from that. When I was asked to step up and lead the center, it was sort of, that was on the back of designing those undergraduate research experiences and some other service work. But it was a natural step for me because it's the same exponential impact. In my own class, I can teach students to the best of my abilities and give them, really well-designed learning assignments. And that's just, I can only help the students I can work with myself physically within that year. But if I can help faculty, particularly those that are new to teaching, because I think that that's intimidating in so many different ways. If I can help them have the confidence that they know what they're doing in the classroom, because we, as faculty in academia, don't necessarily get taught how to teach. There is an assumption that we're great grad students, and therefore we know how to explain and communicate well our discipline to novices, which is very, very rarely the case, actually. So I think it was an opportunity to have that exponential impact, to allow faculty to feel confident that they're using evidence-based techniques. When you use a technique that works, man, it's good for everyone. It's good for the students because they achieve the learning outcomes. It's also good for you as a faculty member because you tried something new. It keeps you fresh. It keeps you alive. It keeps you from burning out. We know that. And so I think probably at my core, I'm someone who likes to work where my purpose and passion and where I feel like I'm honestly helping people the most and making the most positive difference in life. I guess, who was it? George Eliot that said, I think, that's our purpose in life, is to exist to make life easier for others. That's not a direct quote, but that's the essence of what he said. And I think that's kind of what drives me, is if my time here helped make things a little bit better for others, then I think it was worth it.
Right. I have been teaching a long time, and I learn something about teaching every day. And sometimes it's teaching based on, as you said, the evidence-based techniques, things that we know now that we didn't know 10 years ago about how people learn, how the brain works, which is a fascinating area in itself. And sometimes it's that the students that I'm teaching now are definitely not the ones I had 20 years ago or longer ago, that they're still very bright and they still, are capable of learning, but they're just approaching it in a very different way. And their expectations, their problems, their challenges are just different. I was having a discussion this morning with a mother who I got to meet, and her student, her young child, not child, but, adult college-age child now, is on the autism spectrum. And, while of course that existed 20, 30 years ago, of course it did, it always has, there was not the same understanding of it or same recognition of it. And, so that brings the neurodiversity aspect to the classroom, and how do they experience learning? We know a lot more about that. There's still a whole lot more to learn. So as far as teaching is concerned, we're always learning and more about it if we want to be good at it. I'm not sure everybody wants to be that good. I think, like everyone, we can resist certain new things, but it never stops being a field where there's more to learn. So,
Yeah.
And I appreciate what you're doing, because you're bringing a lot of different ideas to the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning. There's been an emphasis this semester I saw on diversity and different types of diversity and other kinds of things. And of course, the center, they have book groups and different, I'm reading a book that was recommended, The Relationship Rich Education. It's fascinating. And so there's always something more to learn about teaching. I don't think we ever stop in any area. And learning is such a fascinating area. So many people do not think, and this goes back to my original statement, that the hard sciences, and I don't like those terminologies, the hard and soft sciences, but they don't think of them as being an area of creativity. Why is this wrong? And how does that make you feel?
Yeah. It's funny. I think even I would have said that myself, but it's not what you would traditionally associate with creativity. And yet, to be able to design experiments, you have to have originality of thought. And I think that when you're truly creative, that originality of thought that's coming from you, and the product that comes as a result of that, whatever that looks like, is something that only you could have created. Right. So I think it's when you look at the outcomes from different research labs, they may use the same basic techniques. They may try and make sure that the variables stay constant, so they're testing what they believe to be testing. But the idea that you've created a hypothesis or made an observation and thought, I wonder what happens if I try this, right? That is in and of itself a creativity of thought and an innovation that only you as the observer can make. And so I think that's the fundamental basis of science is making an observation, creating a hypothesis from that, and then designing an experiment to test it. So whilst we have standard protocols that we follow, often you have to play with those. For my PhD, I did something that was technically very difficult. And so I was using human blood samples, but I was actually looking at parasite DNA within them, which is, as you can imagine, a very, very small part of the overall DNA sample. So I had to find a very creative way to actually get at the small amount of parasite DNA that I was trying to assess. And I had a really, solid hypothesis and a good question, but it was technically very difficult. And so I, for 2 straight years, had to try a variety of different ways and approaches to actually get any data at all to get the experiment to work. So it required an excessive amount of creativity of thought, thinking about, okay, well, let's try this. That didn't work. Okay, let's try this. It didn't work. I wonder if this might work. Let's see if I can apply this to this particular scenario. And so that requires continuing to think outside of the box or the what is, the status quo, right? You're always pushing that boundary to be able to keep moving things forward. And so to me, and I think, what happened with COVID and all the different vaccines is probably a really, really good example of every lab that approached it differently, right? The problem was still the same. We developed a vaccine very quickly to prevent a large number of deaths from something brand new. And that wasn't something anyone had seen before. And so the creativity and originality of each lab's different approach to that actually moved the boundaries of science forwards because of the situation we were in. And so, no 2 researchers are going to come up with the same way of approaching that problem. So to me, that is in essence originality of thought and creativity to be able to make those leaps and bounds. And so, yes, it's not painting, it's not sculpting, it's not, playing music, but it's, to me, an intensely creative thing. So yes, I agree. I think that whilst we don't traditionally associate the hard sciences with creativity, if you're really truly, breaking boundaries and thinking outside the box, it actually has to be.
Yes, speaking of COVID, and that was an excellent example. I'm kind of fascinated with this, what was called the Spanish flu epidemic back in 1919, and I'm reading the John Barry book about that right now. And what's very clear is that there had to be so much creativity, so much thinking outside the status quo, et cetera, for these scientists, mostly men, of course, at that time, but there were women involved as well, to deal with this incredibly contagious and dangerous virus that was just killing people like that. That's one thing that, people didn't usually drop dead from COVID, but in the Spanish flu, and I use that term because people, I had a student ask why they call it Spanish flu, and it was simply because interestingly, it was all over the world, but the Spanish press didn't censor their papers during wartime, and so it got named the Spanish because they were the only one who were talking about it. Kind of strange, but it just amazes me because in this book he goes into such detail with how the scientists had to work so quickly to come up with, different ways to experiment and to extract the virus into, terminology I don't pretend to know, but to make the serums, to try to find something. And it's an amazing story. But that's something that I had, it just opened my eyes a lot to that area of the sciences. And I do have to tell you that up to this point in this podcast, we have not defined the word creativity purposefully, because we just say it exists everywhere. And maybe sometime we'll get to the definition of it. But I just like saying it's only in the arts, putting a definition on it may be a little bit limiting. So, so I haven't quite done that yet. But and consequently, I've had a lot of great discussions. So when are you happiest creatively?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I think there are several different things that I do I think everyone needs a creative outlet, whatever that looks like. And so for me, that's either creating a learning assignment that I think is going to really engage the students, right? They're really going to get engaged and interested in the topic and reach the learning outcomes, and they're going to enjoy it as well. I think that's, learning is fun, and it should be. So I think designing learning experiences is one thing. I think another, this may be unique to teaching, and so I'm thinking about this with my work with faculty and students, is also, you never quite know what questions you're going to be asked in a class session. And so sometimes that can bring out just really good discussion and really, new things that you haven't talked about with other classes or you haven't thought about. So I think that when students ask open and honest, authentic questions, sometimes that can, when you're creating answers to questions, sort of like we are discussing now, I think that can be creativity in the way that you craft a response. I've never been one for writing down lecture notes because I like to create the learning experience in situ while I'm doing it. So I have a plan and I have a general guideline of time, but I find it much more authentic to sort of create it from scratch each time. So I think that can be an avenue for creativity for me when, a student asks a particular question. I'm like, oh, yeah, we can explain it this way. And I find a new way to connect with the students and connect them with the material. And that then becomes part of what I do because, wow, that was a good way to explain it. And it was as a result of a student asking a question. And I think that can be a creative outlet for me. And of course, I like to write. You mentioned that, I've been keeping notes on my experiences moving here because it's very different to what I grew up with. And so from time to time, I do some creative writing, not necessarily for publication, but just to keep writing. So I do write in teaching and learning, and that's I don't really view that as creative, which perhaps that I should. But I often, work on stories and sort of personal writing projects, really just sort of keep my hand in the creative process. Just for another outlet. So it's really fun. It's just for me. And I journal a lot, and I'm sometimes just surprised at what comes out of your brain. You don't realize you've been thinking, that just sort of comes out. Wow, where did that come from? So I think it's any moment like that when you're prompted to not just do the same old, that you can be surprised with what you've been thinking that you weren't necessarily consciously aware of.
Well, and that's something that fascinates me too, and it's a topic for another podcast. Maybe I'll get one of the psychology professors in on this, but is the unconscious and the subconscious mind. And when you start talking about that, people think you're getting some sort of mysticism, and you're simply not. It's just that I'm always surprised, even like you say, in the middle of the class, what comes out of my mouth. And it's so appropriate in that moment. And you just, where did that come from? And the same with writing, it's in there. We're just not conscious of it as we're reflecting on a daily basis. And I'm fascinated with the whole idea of reflection, although I think that it's we use the word so in so many ways, and we throw it around. We tell students to reflect. That I'm playing with how can we explain reflection better, and how can we set up a paradigm of reflection, or a hierarchy, like Bloom's taxonomy or something, to really teach people to reflect, and in a practical way that they can use it. So, yeah, that's that whole idea of what, in the moment, what comes out. And one theory of creativity is, for at least for writing, is that it's when you put two very opposite things together that seem to have no connection whatsoever, and then you find the connection. That's part of creativity as well. But again, we're not going to define it.
Well, I mean, that would be the same at the outcome of a science experiment. You've got perhaps an outcome that you would not expect given the hypothesis, and that drives you to think about something in a totally different way. So I think that is a one possibility when you get to defining it. To me,
we ever do.
I mean, I was thinking as you spoke about the creativity of thought as it comes out in speech. And I was thinking that sometimes that's driven, for me, by wanting to help students as best I can. And so I think that sometimes when you've got a student who's really struggling to understand a topic, and you've gone through it the way that you usually go through it with someone, right? So you would, well, we can think about it this way, we can think about it this way, and you've gone through your usual mechanisms of explaining it, and the student's still not getting it. Mm-hmm. I think that's at the point at which, when your motivation to help that student reach the learning outcome, that also, pushes the boundaries a little bit. And that's sometimes when you get those additional good ideas, and then they become part of what you do because it was successful with that one student. I mean, I think that it's really good to acknowledge that there's not just we tend to default, don't we, to teaching the way that we were taught and that we successfully learned. And yet there are so many different student needs, and I do think that if we're open to it, can help us push the boundaries and serve more students. So that's the only thing I can think of as chatting.
No, that's great. I think the old saying, necessity is the mother of invention, in a sense, but yeah, we are in those situations because of our emotional desire to connect with that student and help them learn. We dig deeper, and not just default to what we've had used before. And I think that's that's one thing that, in dealing with a younger and deeper and different, I should say, type of student, I've had to dig deeper for how I could make the experience in my classroom connect with them in a way that I wouldn't have even thought of, back in years past. Because especially references that I would have had, they don't have any reference points for a lot of things. And I'm not just talking about, landline phones and I'm talking about pop culture references or anything like that. I can't keep up with their pop culture and what they like. I gave up on that a long time ago, simply because it's so diverse anymore. So, you have to find those commonalities, and that goes back to the two very different things coming together. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I appreciate your time and your great insights into teaching and learning and science.
That's great. It was my pleasure. Thank you for asking me.